John, good evening. Can you see me?
Yes, I can see you.
Okay, we see your lovely face and the audience here. Audience, Dr. John Anthony West, give him a hand, please. John, I have your, we all know you. They've read your bio online. I have your first picture. Would you like to say anything before we start the program?
Well, I don't know. You tell me what you want me to say. I mean, I'm on for 2 hours, right?
Yes, sir.
And you're going to be interviewing me.
I am.
Throwing the questions at me.
Actually, I'm showing the slides as we speak. That's what I'm saying.
Ah, well, okay. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I'm on the slide 1. It's got. Do you have the slides in front of you? The one you sent me. Do you have it in front of you, sir?
No, I can't because I've got you on the. I don't know how to put that up with you on the other side. But you can. Can I not see it?
Let me see how you can share the screen with us. Great.
I don't know how to do that. I mean, I don't.
Oh, okay. Well, I see what you're saying. Yeah. Hold on, John. Hold on.
Okay.
Well, if you do it, okay, 1 second.
Oh, that's great. Go back one.
Yeah, John, be patient with me. Okay, this is complicated. My technician went to another room and.
Okay.
Yeah, he's busy doing other stuff. So.
Patience is a much overrated virtue, but I'll try.
We got to learn that from you, John.
I can teach certain things, but patience never.
Okay, so going back. All right, let's see. There you go.
Good, right.
Tell us about this one.
Well, you want me to start right in, or do you want me to give a bit of a preamble about how we come to all of this?
Yeah, preamble is good. Yeah, preamble.
Yeah, okay. Well, the preamble sometimes takes a while, but the Sphinx will still be there by the time I'm finished. Anyway, okay. Now, here's a little bit of background, and that is that, nowadays you turn on the internet, and I mean, every week there's some tiresome little 5-year-old kid playing Beethoven's Kreutzer Sonata, standing on his head, eating an ice cream cone. And it really makes you feel stupid. I was never one of those. But what I was, I like to think, I was psychologically precocious. And I knew at the age of 13 what kids now tend to know, but nobody knew that in 1945 when I was 13, which is that I was born into a lunatic asylum. And everybody knows that now. But I knew it early on, and those were lonely years. By the time I hit 19, I knew what I wanted to do, which was I wanted to be the little boy who said that the emperor has no clothes, and I wanted to be a writer. Had no idea, none whatsoever, not an inkling that I would ever be doing scholarship. But I wanted to be a writer, and specifically a satirist, and prove to everyone that what they called progress was really an insane asylum. And it took me not that long to start getting published. I was 25 actually, and I got the first story was accepted by anybody my age. Probably most of the people my age are dead, so none of them are in the audience, probably. But there was a very prestigious, very interesting magazine around the time called New World Writing, And they accepted my first short story. So that was a big day. I mean, that's what I count as my real birthday, my earlier birthday. Anybody can do, and everybody does, so they wouldn't be here. Anyway, I was at that time wildly in love with a woman who wouldn't have me, thank God. And I'd been in Europe for a year and a half in the army, actually, mostly in Germany, driving around in my one and only and last Porsche. In the heyday of no speed limits, the cops all drove Volkswagens, no radar, nothing. So I was all over Europe in my flying Porsche, as I said, the first and last I ever had. And when that story was published, I wanted to get back to Europe, where they named streets after poets, and got out of this madhouse over here. So I ended up in Spain. And one thing, a long story, I mean, but I won't go into it here. And, got into my writing. I had a number of short stories published, a number of plays done in England, off fringe theater, which would here be off Broadway. Nothing ever made any money. I mean, still, with all my track record, I still don't have any money. And I got a novel published, and there one of my friends there, I got interested in astrology. More long story, but I won't go into it. And a friend who was there at some point or another, because I was talking about all of this stuff, and people were, and I never had a particular interest in the predictive side of astrology, which is what everyone's interested in. I was much more interested in it as an ancient sacred science. And one of my casual friends there, not a close friend, told me about a book called The Theory of Celestial Influence by a man called Rodney Cullen, who it turned out was a student of Gurdjieff, who I'd never heard of at that time. As I said, by this time now I was maybe 28 or so. I'd never heard of Gurdjieff, and he fed me the Gurdjieff books, the books by his followers and students, until finally he deemed me ready for the man himself. And again, without going into detail, what I found most appealing about Gurdjieff was that he was the first person I'd ever read, or met, let's say, posthumously, who was as contemptuous of Western civilization as I was. A few of us out there. Henry Miller was almost as savage about it as I am, and another writer now forgotten. Someone actually, Nathaniel West, no relation to me, brilliant writer. Philip Wiley, and there are a number of people around in those days, but Gurdjieff was the first one who I really took seriously, who was as contemptuous of the whole big picture as I was. The difference was that he knew how to live within it, and I didn't, anyway, not very comfortably. So I got myself involved, and still am involved, with the Gurdjieff work, as it's called. And that led me by some degrees to England, where I was shortly have a novel published that was almost a big movie on several occasions, and it never happened. More John Karma somehow or another. Anyway, there I got friendly with my editor at the publishing house, who was a Cambridge-trained mathematician turned publisher. Very opposite me. We were good friends, but he was rationalist, materialist, and I, by this time. Gurdjieff was a fascinating study, not for the faint of heart, actually, but early on, I realized that he had done something of immense importance, which was to put together the ancient wisdom that had existed from time immemorial, but in a context that made it, that was designed to be carried out, to be practiced in the lunatic asylum that we live in. And that really did attract me, because I wasn't living in it very comfortably. Anyway, I got involved in a Gurdjieff group there, and in England, London, I moved there. And one of the people in my group, with my friend, the mathematician turned publisher, we were having a pint in a pub one day, and the subject of astrology came up, and he said, "Oh, that's a bunch of codswallop." And I said, "Well, no, it isn't. As a matter of fact, I know a lot about this subject." And he said, "There's some scientific evidence, some of it direct, more of it indirect, that says there is a real case to be made for astrology." And he said, "Well, I'd like to see that." So I brought in documentation, and he said, that's really interesting. I'm not necessarily convinced myself, but would you do a book on it? And my standard answer for a question like that is basically, you pay me some money and I'll do a book on anything. That's not quite true. But in this case, this was fine. Anyway, that set me off on my first nonfiction book. And by now, as I said, I got a lot of stuff published, none of which made any money. And in reading, one of the people in my group told me that it was a book I should read because I was just then researching the history of astrology, which is thought to be a Babylonian superstition made rational or rationalized by the early Greeks, the ancient Greeks. And I didn't buy that. It didn't feel right, didn't sound right to me, but I had no proof to the contrary. And Gurdjieff talks about astrology being there way, way, way back in the distant past. Anyway, there was the one esoteric bookshop in London called Watkins Bookshop. I think it's still there. And a friend of mine told me in my Gurdjieff group, go look, there's a book called Herbach, a novel that goes into these sorts of subjects. So I went there and sure enough, they had it. And the 2-volume novel, that in fact was a terrible novel. It's not so easy to write a good novel. People think just because they have ideas, they can write novels. They can't. Anyway, not everyone can. But it was by a woman called Isha Schwaller-de-Lubitsch. And the picture of Egypt that came across loud and clear, even though the novel was wooden and transparent and so on, but the picture of Egypt was remarkably similar to the picture that Gurdjieff had written about, and they're more or less coeval. She kept on referring, it was strange because it was a novel with lots of footnotes, and it kept on referring to a book called The Temple of Man, the Temple de l'Homme, and that evidently her husband had written. And I finally got fascinated enough, and I lived all the way on the other side of London, Ealing, which is about as far as you could get from the British Museum library. But I went to that library, and sure enough, they had a copy of the book. And you can tell nobody had read it. It was in French, of course, and which I didn't speak at the time. I spent sort of entry-level French. But I got this book out and cut the pages that hadn't been cut. That you had to do that yourself in the old days in France, and just riffled through it. And by this time, as I said, I was a pro. I wasn't 28 years old or so, but I'd had a lot published, and just as you give a baseball player watches someone take 3 swings of the bat and knows if whoever it is can play the game, or a concert musician listens to somebody play a couple of scales and can judge if that person can handle the instrument. So to me, I riffled the pages of this book and realized that this was a work of immense importance, because this is René, R.A. Schwaller-de-Lubitsch, who was Isha's husband, had put together the ancient wisdom, the sacred science of the ancients, in a manner that was accessible to our modern, rational, intellectually trained minds. And mind you, it was a difficult enough book. I actually had to learn French on the fly to read this book. But I went to the library. I couldn't find a copy to buy, and I went to the library every day for about a year, all the way across London and back, reading, following this book. I stopped work on my astrology book, and eventually, when the case for astrology was published, I had a long chapter about Schwaller, which really didn't belong there. It was just that I felt it was so important Nobody, Schwaller was, apart from his wife's book, the novel, apart from the novel, none of his work had been translated into English. So I was introducing this to the English-speaking audience.
John.
And what?
John, we have a lot of slides. We have a lot of slides.
I know, it's all right. Don't worry. We'll get through them. Anyhow, at a certain point, doing my homework about Schwaller, in one of his books, he's talking about the chronology of Egypt. And he mentions, almost as a passing thought, he built up a long scholarly argument about that Egypt was much, much older, that the Egyptians themselves believed that their civilization stretched many of thousands of years back, further into the past. And Dulivich came up with this one observation. He said, oh yes, of course, the Great Sphinx of Giza shows unmistakable signs of aquatic erosion, in other words, water weathering. And I realized that was something that should be scientifically provable, and that if it had been weathered by water and not by wind and sand, which was the general conviction at the time, now it's a bit changing a little bit, but if you could prove that, and that you needed geology, it would prove that the greatest greatest carving on earth, and the Sphinx is unquestionably that, even though it's ruinous, had been built at a time when there's not supposed to be any civilization at all. In other words, if you could verify that single line in Schwaller, you would change all of ancient history. I mean, if you could really prove it, you get the scientists behind it, everything that you've ever learned in school would have to be about ancient civilization, would have to go down the drain, which is where most of it should go anyway. But if I may quote myself in the line in the astrology book, that is, Western education is to the mind, but AIDS is to the immune system. The more exposure you have to it, the more likely it is to be lethal. Anyhow, I realized, so that set me off on a quest, and it took a long time. I verified. I mean, I'm not a geologist, but I know how to read. So a lot of reading went into developing the whole Sphinx theory. Sphinx is water, and so that was a long chapter in the first book. My first book about Egypt, called "Serpent in the Sky: The High Wisdom of Ancient Egypt," which is an introduction to Schwaller's very complex and fairly impenetrable work. Even now, it's all published in English. Anybody can read it, but it's pretty impenetrable even in English. And the Serpent serves, to this day, the Serpent serves as a really thorough and quite readable introduction to it. So what happened then was it took a long time, and I eventually, this is a more long story that I won't get into, met a geologist willing to look at this theory, Robert Chalk, who anybody who knows my work will be very familiar with. And we went over to Egypt, and over the course of a couple of trips, got convinced that this was actually completely true, and he had the academic credentials to back it up. He had a PhD, a double PhD from Yale in geology and geophysics and paleontology in there somewhere. And we gave a presentation at the GSA, that's the Geological Society of America, annual convention.
I'm sorry, what was GSA? GSA was what?
GSA, Geological Society of America.
Oh, okay.
And in San Diego, actually, was the conference, 91. And we gave a presentation there, and we were the hit of the show. I mean, the GSA called press conferences all of a sudden from absolutely nowhere, because of course it had Chalk's credentials behind it. We had major headlines, New York Times, all the scientific magazines, everybody picked up this story. And the geologist, the attending geologist, who, according to Schock, could be very snarky and very critical. If they didn't like something, they were not being politically or, let's say, academically correct. They would let you know. And the water weathering of the Sphinx was unanimously accepted by every scientist, every geologist who came by our poster presentation signed on to it. I mean, they were 100% convinced. Here, this is a little bit of a digression, but it's worth telling because it's funny. So the press was surprising. And this was really a radical theory. I mean, just think, everything that you've ever read in school about ancient civilization would have to go up the spout because of this single observation of the Lubitsch's. And so the geologists were all in favor of it, but the archaeologists and the Egyptologists were absolutely rabid. I mean, they were hurling abuse at us. Can't imagine the things that they were saying. And at one point, Schock, who teaches at Boston University, was being interviewed by telephone. I mean, lots of the scientific press were there, but the Boston, the guy from the Globe, was not there, but he first interviewed Schock, who was very gentlemanly and civil about it. And then it was my turn to be interviewed. And he asked me, he said, well, you know, what is this? The geologists are all in favor. And the academics, the Egyptologists and the archaeologists are absolutely, you know, hurling abuse at you. You know, what accounts for that? And I said, you know, this is a theory that's based entirely 100% upon the weathering patterns of rocks. And when it comes to weathering patterns of rocks, an Egyptologist or an archaeologist's opinion is no more valid than a proctologist. And this they published in the Boston Globe. So this did not go well with I don't know why, with the archaeological department at Boston University at Schock. And one of the women there, who shall go nameless, at least for a while, until Schock and I put this book together about the whole Sphinx theory, wrote this in the in-house Boston University journal. They have, their own magazine. All universities have it. And she wrote this scathing, personal, a character assassination about Schock. And I said to Schock, you can't take that, Schock. You got to get back at him. And he said, no, just let it go pass. And I said, well, you do mind if I'll write her a personal letter? He said, well, yeah, okay, you go, you do that. So I wrote her a letter, and I started it off. I heard the department took exception to my observation that, about the proctologists. And I said, but I got to tell you, the proctologists didn't like it either. They said their job was to cure sick assholes. They didn't like being compared to them. So this didn't have the comforting or the palliative effect that I was hoping for. I thought we'd be good friends after that observation, but no. And so what she did was to pass this around the whole Egyptological community all over the world. She sent it out, which I couldn't have asked for anything better. I mean, this was Bear Rabbit and the Briar Patch all over again. Anyway, sorry to digress on that, but I like the story. Anyway, so this got taken up, and this is a controversy. This led us eventually to NBC. A friend of ours who was one of the producers of not Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indiana Jones one, and that's Raiders of the Lost Ark. That's right. And he got us past the secretary.
No, I went off, offline. I'm back, Alan, I'm back. Huh? Somebody hacked it.
Hey, we're back.
Yeah, sorry, we lost the internet, but somebody hacked us. But maybe Chinese. You're back.
No, it's probably some archaeologist or Egyptologist.
You're on again. Go ahead.
Yeah, I see. Well, can we get the slide up?
Ladies here love you. I never seen they laugh on anybody like you. So you're good with women, man.
Really? I didn't know that.
They love you. They say. All right. Cool.
Yeah.
Now you start from this one.
There we go. Okay, now you see that the unfortunate, I can't do a laser pointer on that, but you see that's the Sphinx, obviously, and you see the deep weathering around the side of the Sphinx. A lot of it is repair work, but more important even is the enclosure wall behind it. And you see, in order to form the Sphinx, what they had to do was quarry out the rock because at the top part there you see the plateau. So the Sphinx looks as though it's sort of cut. It's bedrock, of course. It's not built, it's carved. And in order to free the core body of the Sphinx, they had to carve out, had to quarry out all of this tremendous amount of stone around it so that the Sphinx is sort of, it's as though it's sitting in a gigantic bathtub. But the nature of the water, of the weathering, is specifically this rainwater weathering, and it's the result. And now, as I said, most 99.99% of the geologists are 100% on board with this water weathering theory and the way that we explain it. The archaeologists and Egyptologists are still battling it and have come up with alternative theories, which basically they're agreeing now that it's water weathered, not wind and sand weathered. Again, this is a long argument on my trips. In fact, I should mention the trips, by the way. I lead a few trips a year, 3 or 4 trips a year to Egypt from the theory or the interpretation of Egypt that Svala de Lubitsch developed. It's called Symbolist Egypt, both by detractors and by its adherents. And so I lead these trips 3-4 times a year, looking at Egypt from the symbolist point of view. And in a couple of minutes, I'll get to why that is not just a quibble amongst quibbling, not just amongst the sort of opposing academics, who, by the way, I like to call quackademics. It's much more than that. The implications of changing, the implications of understanding that ancient civilizations, ancient sophisticated civilizations, extend back into the prehistorical past by many, many thousands of years, is of immediate importance once you understand what's involved. And I will get into this second. I will get into it as we go along. I want to build up the case for the water weathering. I mean, you can just take my word for it, but that's just this spectacular photo taken by a friend of mine. Anyway, I'll get into why Egypt is as important as it is. There's our Sphinx again, a great photograph. A good friend of mine named Sarit Sand has done a book of photography. I think maybe the best book of Egyptian. There are plenty of good photography books on Egypt, but this one is really spectacular. It's called The Eternal Light of Egypt. And it's really a wonderful book. Great Christmas presents and stuff like that. Anyway, that's one of her pictures of the Sphinx. Could we do the next slide, actually, Simon? Okay, now you see, up until recent, that's a shot taken around 1900 or so, 1890. And you see that it's almost covered up to the neck in sand, because that's what happens. The winds blow, the sandstorms blow from the Khamsin, blow from the south. And if you don't keep the Sphinx enclosure swept out nice and clean every few weeks, or anyway, after there's a sandstorm, which it's February, March of the sandstorms, and they're not that common either. But 20, 30 years, it builds up like that. And once it's built up, it can't get weathered by wind and sand, which is the usual theory. And going back into the texts and into the documentation, you can prove that out of the Sphinx is supposed to have been carved by the pharaoh Khafra, the successor to Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid, or anyway, a huge addition onto the Great Pyramid. That's the pyramids are another complicated story. They're not what we see is probably done when they're supposed to be done, but even they are superimposed on or replace structures that were there earlier. Anyhow, once it's covered up with sand, of course it can't weather, and you can prove pretty well within, broadly speaking, that it's supposed to have been built about 2500 BC, and it's been covered up with sand. That's 4,500 years. It's been covered up to the neck with sand for around 3,000 or 3,500 years of that time. So that leaves only about 1,000 years for it to weather with this incredible deep weathering. Can we have the next slide, Saeed? Okay, I'll get back to the weathering in a second. More long story, but I won't get into it here. But this is the profile of the Sphinx. For years before the Egyptologists decided, nobody knew who built the Sphinx. There are no signs on it, no signatures or anything like that. And it's thought to have resembled, or the face is supposed to be that of Khafra, who is supposed to be the one who carved the Sphinx. There's no real evidence for that, but the Sphinx is at the bottom. There's a causeway that leads from the Sphinx into the center of that second pyramid. So that's the attribution of it, that it was carved by the pharaoh Khafra. in his own image. And actually, one of the opposition, a man, Egyptologist, archaeologist named Mark Lehner, who spent years and years studying the Giza Plateau and has come up with a lot of good stuff. In fact, a lot of my evidence comes from him, but he doesn't interpret it correctly. And back in the 80s, when computer graphics first became, usable, it was early stages. But he did an article, a study of the Sphinx, sort of basically doing a computer model of the Sphinx's head, and of the Khafra head, and comparing it, and placed it on the Sphinx's body, and said, voila, the Sphinx is really Khafra. Well, since they used the Sphinx's head as the Khafra head as the model, this is what you see is what computer language. Anyway, when we finally got to doing our video, I mean, I could see this got a lot of press, Smithsonian, New York Times, also, and this was accepted by virtually everyone. When we finally got around to doing our video, I realized we had to address that problem. And originally, what I wanted to do was to use exactly Lehner's technique, but instead of the head of Khafra, I wanted to use the head of Elvis and put it on the Sphinx and say, well, see, the Sphinx is really Elvis. And this was a fun idea. But believe it or not, there is an Elvis Foundation, and you had to get permission to use the king in whatever context you wanted to use it, and they didn't want this. And I thought, I think Elvis would have loved to have been the Sphinx. But anyway, we couldn't do that. So my partner in this whole project, my criminal partner, I call him, but without him, it never would have happened, instantly came up with the idea, well, let's get a forensic detective to do a forensic study of Khafra and of the Sphinx and see what we get. It's more a long story, but anyway, we got the chief forensic detective from the New York Police Department to come back with us to Egypt and to do a study of using standard forensic techniques. Now, do we have the next slide? Okay, you can see it. Can you see this? Like, is that clear? It's not clear on the thing. Okay, well, there.
It's clear. It's clear.
You see the Sphinx. There you see Khafra. And you see the difference in the angles here. Well, according to Frank Domingo, there is no possible way in which these two heads, both of them, masterful, by the way, in terms of the artistic skill that went into them, no way could they be the same, modeled upon the same human being. In other words, so the whole attribution to Khafra was out the window. And it was very funny because Boris Said was, in fact, his name, as half Persian, half Russian. And when Domingo came out after a long study and said, well, this is definitely not the same person. Moreover, earlier, throughout the 19th century, visitors to the Sphinx would notice, you see that profile, that looks like an African profile, sub-Saharan African, not Egyptian African. And of course, nobody knows about it. This is no longer taken into consideration. But according to Domingo, his exact language was that this was consistent with sub-Saharan African physiognomy. And Boris, who had a sense of humor in his own right, when we got that news, he said, for the academics, this is bad news and worse news. He said, the bad news is that there wasn't Atlantis. The worst news is they were black. So we had a lot of fun with that, but we didn't mention it and publicly because we were in enough trouble as it was with the academic community. And interestingly enough, a couple of years later, after this, I did an op-ed piece for the New York Times about the Sphinx and Frank Domingo's work, the forensic work, but I left out this whole thing of it possibly being black. And lo and behold, about a couple of weeks later, they published a a letter to the editor from an orthodontist who was another kind of expert in facial structures who pointed that out. And he was a white guy. That this was typically a black profile. So this is a big, big mystery, actually. And even though we didn't mention it, we didn't talk about it at the time, Chuck and I have a book planned, if I ever get around to finish the stuff I'm working on now, in which we tell this whole Sphinx story. And in this one, we will come right out with it. And there's the black Sphinx, and you don't like it, come up with an alternative explanation, because that comes from one of the leading experts in human physiognomy. I mean, the chief forensic detective of the New York Police Department. Anyway, let's go. Let's keep going. So there's the statue of Khafra, this fabulous masterpiece of a statue, done more than life size in the Cairo Museum. Keep going. Okay, now we get into the geology. There's a whole bunch of slides here, but you see, this is typical when we saw and shot into this. Said this is typical of water weathering, not floodwaters. That would be different. And besides, for complicated reasons, it couldn't be flooded to this height. I mean, this is the top of the enclosure wall. It's way high. It's high up, and it's a 60-foot wall. You have all of it. Anyway, this can only happen by water coursing down plateau, which slopes from the pyramids down into the Sphinx enclosure, and it creates exactly that kind of a profile with these rounded undulating curves. If it were wind and sand weathering, it wouldn't have that. Now let's next one. We'll go as quickly as I can here through there. Okay, there you get a sense of the extreme amount of weathering. That's us, me in the front, walking down the ledge, and you see that ledge that I'm walking on is a harder layer of limestone, and basically you see it's 3 or 4 feet wide, and then the more weathered part slopes up from it. And what I'm walking on is a much harder layer of limestone, which is nevertheless weathered in its own right. When you measure it all out, you see that the softer limestone top, which is not soft. It's not as though we're talking about clay. It's a pretty technical term. It's competent limestone. The deeper, softer layers that are cut way back, this is as much as 12, 15 feet of weathering. So the question now comes up, under what kind of conditions would it take to produce that kind of weathering? And this is a question we can't address at the moment. We await. Things go very slowly. It's like changes in. Actually, they used to have all of these funny jokes, good jokes about the shortest books in the world. A whole bunch of them. Who's Who in Puerto Rico, and a biographical dictionary of Italian war heroes. Very politically incorrect jokes. High on Welsh gourmet cooking. That's why I lived in Wales for a while. But maybe the shortest book of all is New Ideas in Egyptology. So things go very slowly. But some kind of very extreme conditions of long period of time, only that can have produced this. And we're hoping, if we get back there, to do a follow-up, a sequel to The Mystery of the Sphinx, that we get the funding to get a bunch of geologists over there, some of them who agree with us, and the few of those that don't, to duke it out and really ideally come up with something definitive about that it is water weathering, and maybe some kind of ballpark figure about what kind of time and what kind of conditions it would take to produce weathering of this nature. Nothing like it anywhere on the Giza Plateau. Well, there are a couple of places where there is something like it, which has to be In other words, there has to have been a lot of things that date from that earlier period. There's me in the middle of, standing in one of those deep fissures that the running water has eroded out from the face of the bedrock. Keep going. Okay, well now there's more. This is more evidence there. Anyway, that's water weathering in and of itself. You see, this is the corner of the Khafra pyramid, and you see that the lower courses of stone look very, very different from the courses up above. There's only one possible explanation for this, and that's that they're built at different times. Because in architectural history, everybody knows that you're a student. Everybody knows that two different styles of building or of masonry or of architecture within the same building mean two different periods of time. It's never anything other than different, and never anything other than that, except in Egyptology, where they say that it's built by the same people. It's like if you buy a Victorian house, and it has a nice modern kitchen in it. You don't think that, wow, these were pretty cool Victorians. They went to IKEA and put in this really nice new kitchen. No, everybody knows that somebody took the old kitchen and made a new kitchen. So all of this, you see, all of these pieces of evidence that I'm running through quickly. When we're on my Egypt trip, we have a whole morning spent by the Sphinx to really get into the nuts and bolts of all of this. Oh, by the way, I should say, I've got a trip coming up. Anybody who has the money and the time and the interest, I'm doing a trip in just a few weeks that still has a couple of spaces left on it. Go to my website. You'll find it, jawest.net or jawest.com, and click on it. And there's still a few spaces left. Anybody wants to jump in. So here we have, because you see the blocks, we'll get into this now. Not only, okay, let me backtrack a little bit. As I said, the geology of the Sphinx is absolute proof, unchallengeable proof that they've got all of very ancient history wrong. Because here's the most spectacular sculpture on earth that was carved by unknown people at a time when civilization isn't supposed to have existed at all. It's supposed to be all hunter-gatherers. The Egyptians themselves, more long story, but basically they have a couple of chronological texts. One is a stone tablet, another is a very ruinous papyrus, where they talk about those earlier periods of Egyptian history, and they actually even have dates for them. They have when Egypt was ruled by the gods, supposedly by the Necheru themselves, who were the so-called gods. But the gods, understood properly, are cosmic functions. They're cosmic principles. They're not superstitious. They're not figments of the superstitious imagination, probably high on some kind of enjoyable drug. But they are rather cosmic principles. We'll get into that in probably at some depth tomorrow when I do the second lecture. So here, what we were just looking at with the paving stones around the Sphinx itself, couldn't see it easily on the slide before, but some of those blocks of stone, this is an edge-on view, some of those blocks of stone are 20 and 30 feet, with a surface. And this shows the depth of them. The depth of them is about between 5 and 8 feet. Now, a block of limestone, a single block of limestone that's 20 by 30 by 8, weighs well over 200 tons. So whoever was building this thing could wrestle around, obviously, without an awful lot of trouble. And they didn't have any, as far as we know, they didn't have any of our kind of machinery there. And so this is perhaps the even more challenging or difficult part of the theory for the academics to accept, because we couldn't do that today. we couldn't build that wall today, or if we put our minds to it, maybe we could, but only by using the biggest land cranes that we have available. And then you'll see in a second where we have the wall of the temple surrounding, right adjacent to the Sphinx, that when we were doing our video, we went to a building project out in Long Island with doing a cogeneration plant that had 200-ton boilers they were erecting. But so we went to the manager, the project manager. It's on the video, by the way. The video is still around. It's and they haven't been showing it much lately. They were showing it a lot up to about over 10 years or so. And you can, it's called, the show is called The Mystery of the Sphinx. You can get it on Netflix, or I have copies of it if anybody wants a DVD of it. But you can see this today. Anyway, the point is here that not only is the most spectacular sculpture on Earth carved at a time when there's not supposed to be any civilization to speak of, but the technology involved in these paving stones and in the temple that we'll see in 2 seconds next to the Sphinx is such that we couldn't reproduce it today. We can fly to the moon and send spaceships around Mars. But we couldn't build those temples without going to a hell of a lot of trouble and inventing a new technology that would allow us to not just cut and move these gigantic stones, but also to get them in place. The project manager at the cogeneration plant said, well, yeah, they could lift those with a crane, but it would take weeks to make one throw, as it were, to move one stone. But they wouldn't know how to rig them in such a way that they could get them into place so tight and barely get a piece of paper between the joints. So not only is civilization much older than is thought, but they were in possession of the technology that we don't have to this day, and it is our technology, with all of our wonderful hydrogen bombs and bobblehead dolls and all the other vestiges of our civilization, that with all of those modern wonders, we still couldn't build we almost couldn't carve the Sphinx, maybe barely, but we wouldn't know how to build one of those temples. So this is why it's the implications of this that are so important, and that even if unexpressed by the academic community, hidden beneath it, they don't even know that they have religion, but it's called the Church of Progress. And it is absolute heresy to even suggest that ancient people in the far distant, remote past, before 10,000 BC. Oh yeah, I didn't get this book. I was on to the Palermo stone and the Turin papyrus. You compute out the dates that the Egyptian gave, the regnal years for the divine kings that ruled for thousands and thousands of years, and you get a date of around 36,000 BC. Now, this is another instance of another one of this. This is in Abydos. It's supposedly the attribution of this one we feel is very, very wrong as well. All of these are sort of, they fit together like a Rubik cube. All of the different pieces of evidence of this vanished and lost civilization.
John,
yes,
is this the same era as the Giza pyramid?
We think so. It's more complicated than that, Saeed, because we're pretty sure that the pyramids, well, you saw the Khafra pyramid it's built in at least 2 stages, and the Great Pyramid probably the same. This it could be of the Sphinx era, it could be of another era, but for a variety of reasons, we are quite certain. And believe me, when I'm sort of going past this, you keep changing the slides on me, so I can't blather on forever the way I would normally do. But they all fit together as let's say, as like a Rubik cube. But the end result is that is that our complete notion of what civilization was once like has to be changed in its entirety. And this is another aspect that I'll bring up now. See if I'm controlling the slide.
Is Khafra the same age as the Grand Giza pyramid?
Well, supposedly Khafra is the son of, or Khafren in the Greek, but it's Khafra in Egyptian, of Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid. But we're pretty certain, Chuck and myself, that he did a huge addition to an already existing but probably ruinous structure. And this is called the Osirion, the grave of Osiris, and a temple called Abydos, a wonderful temple. But this is very different from the temple itself. It's just this enormous resonating, it's incredible structure. It's not that big, but it's pretty amazing. And one of the things actually with Egypt is that I often start a lecture off by saying that Egypt is like sex. That gets everybody's attention. And then why is it like sex? Well, you can read all about it, and that's informative. And you can look at pictures, and that's also informative, but in a different way. But until you actually experienced it, you really don't understand it. So this is a pretty good picture, and it's pretty impressive, but it's very different from actually being there. And at the end of 14 days in Egypt, talking about it 6 or 8 hours a day, from the symbolist point of view, you actually, you meaning anybody whose sensitivity hasn't been destroyed by education, but you come to a visceral understanding of what real civilization once was like. And this gets important when you see the lunatic asylum imploding upon itself before our very eyes. So this is not, as I said earlier, this is not a quibble between academics. There's a lot involved in this. And we'll get into the philosophy and symbolist Egypt, I guess, we'll get into that tomorrow, because I probably won't get to anyway.
John,
I'm supposed to do 2 things. Go ahead.
John,
what?
So Osiris was buried underneath this building?
Supposedly, no, not. Osiris isn't a person. Osiris is a principle. The gods are principles. I'll get into that maybe today, maybe tomorrow. It's not superstition. As soon as you say the gods, everyone goes wink, wink, nod, nod. Well, those funny old primitives didn't know any better. It's not that at all. They're cosmic principles. Let's say, just for the moment, that the organic cosmic principles are fertilization, gestation, birth, growth, maturity, senescence, death, and renewal. Each of those are principles. They don't just sort of happen by imaginary evolution. They're cosmic principles, and the ancient Egyptians certainly, but all of the other ancient civilizations as well, knew that perfectly well. And each one of those principles is associated with a particular deity, these are divine principles, and they're associated with a particular deity. And I'll get into this in much more detail when we get into what makes the sacred sacred, which is the last part of tomorrow.
John,
Anyway,
some Egyptian people have seen a body of Pharaoh that they say, I don't know if it's Pharaoh, but they say is Osiris, and is alive. It's like a very fresh body. It's with the skin and everything, laying on a slab.
Well, I'm sorry. Well, all I can say is I haven't seen it, and this is the first I've ever heard about that. But,
okay. I just want to ask you that. Okay.
Yeah. And I'll be polite about it. But Osiris, all of the other gods are so-called gods. Even in Egyptian, they're called the Necheru. Schwaller thought that it might be in ancient times. I'm not sure of this. The root of our word nature might be. I'm not sure of that. Anyway, there's Shock and myself, right in the Osirion, which fills up with water. they don't keep pumping it out, or at certain times of the year when the Nile water table goes up and down. But with us there, you get a sense of the scale of these fantastic columns that the thing is built upon. It's really amazing. I mean, everywhere you go in Egypt, the scale of it, I mean, you look at this, you see the scale, but when you're in it, I mean, it's quite literally, it takes your breath away. You come out of Egypt understanding the difference between civilization and what we call progress. You can't miss it. And actually, quotes that I like, Florence Nightingale, a much misunderstood and absolutely brilliant woman, visited Egypt in 1850, and she sent a whole bunch of letters back home to her family and friends that were only discovered relatively recently in the 80s and put together in a book. And she writes to her parents at some point or another. She says, one wonders that people can come back from Egypt and live lives the way they lived them before.
John, how deep is that?
It's really true. It's
how deep is that water, please?
Oh, the water's not very deep, sort of knee-high water. And it drains out. I mean, the water table level drains it out. When this was built, it probably did not fill up with water, probably because the water table was much lower then. It's built up over the years and years and years of Nile floods. But that's another matter altogether.
What do you estimate the age of this Abydos?
We don't know. See, and it's difficult to date. Even with the Sphinx itself, we need all of the geologists. We need it's half a dozen geologists with the right kind of expertise to do certain kinds of tests. Now there are tests of sorts that can test the radioactivity, the radioactive elements within the stone. So here you could, in theory, do the same thing, and get some sort of a ballpark figure. For complicated reasons, we think this may be, when I said before that Egypt, in the earliest reign of divine beings called Egypt, was ruled by the Necheru themselves. I take that to mean that these are, let's say, in spiritual terms, initiated human beings, live human beings, not gods, as it were, but people who reached the final state of enlightenment, which they still do, still talk about in the Eastern religions that are, still functioning today. You don't hear much of it. The nutcases that are talking about the Western religions. Even this new Pope, who's, for a change, a human being, even he does not broach the true spiritual aspect of his own church. He may well know about it, but he's busy talking about other things that need to be addressed. And good thing he is too. He sounds like an interesting guy. Actually, anybody who gets the right wingers as angry as he does has to have something right about him. So anyway, now this is hang on, hold this slide. Don't switch it on me for a while. So in fact, we shouldn't have had to fight this battle all of these 30 years. What is it now? 25 years, shock got on board. Because really the evidence has been sitting in front of us all along. Not in this case, these are the Paleolithic cave paintings. And this is the most spectacular of the Paleolithic caves. In fact, I'm sure everybody who's watching this knows about the caves of Lascaux, the Hall of Bulls, and the caves of Altamira, also equally spectacular cave paintings from the inside. And those caves are dated to around 19,000 BC by the academics themselves. It was a big fight to get them to understand that these were ancient caves. There's a very good chapter in Graham Hancock's, not the last book that he wrote, but the one before that, called Supernatural. There's a terrific long chapter talking about the battle that the early archaeologists, I guess the early archaeologists, many of them just amateurs, had to fight to get the quackademic community to realize that these weren't hoaxes and that they were indeed very, very ancient. Anyway, this is relatively recently discovered. It's called the Cave of Chauvet. It is also down in the Dordogne of the South France in the Pyrenees. And this is the most, artistically, this is the most spectacular of all the caves by a lot. And this is the academic community, they date it to around 31,000 BC or older. Now, these are artistic geniuses. They're painting this presumably with their fingers on rough cave walls. They incorporate perspective, they incorporate all kinds of visual tricks, and primitives, savages, do not paint masterpieces. Whoever built these, and see, this is one of the weird things about academia. In general, academics have no creativity within them. They're busy, they're intellectual bean counters for the most part. There are exceptions. Schock is one of them. They do, well, my line before, about Western education is to the mind as AIDS is to the immune system. There are some, just as with AIDS, there are quite a number of people who carry the virus, don't succumb to the disease. There still are, here and there, a few rare academics who can actually still think, having gone through their PhD. But it doesn't take a lot to realize, but as I said, for people who are not creative themselves, who've never written an advertising jingle, much less a novel, or painted a picture, what goes into the artistry shown in these caves, this is fantastic, actually. This is 31,000 BC. They may have been living in mud huts. They may have been hunter-gatherers. See, this is another fallacy. They think that civilization starts with farming. No, it's the other way around. Farming is degenerate. And it's also very hard work. What red-blooded man wouldn't rather hunt and fish for his food and plow a field behind a horse? Let's say nothing of a tractor and a combine harvester. The whole thing is completely wrong. So anyway, this is the proof. You wouldn't even need, if you had your head working and your emotional faculties still working, you wouldn't even need a Sphinx and the water weathering theory and all of the stuff that I've been talking about and working on all of these decades. This one cave, or a couple of other caves as well, is enough to tell you that the people who did this were artistic geniuses. I mean, they might not have had smartphones or dumb phones, or they probably didn't have bobblehead dolls even, and no atom bombs, nothing. But boy, could they paint? So really, when you put all of this evidence together, and as I said, almost nobody, as far as I know, this is Schock and myself, we have this angle on it. I mean, really, the mystery of the Sphinx was pretty much a game changer. I mean, it started, there are now a lot of people out there, and some of them very brilliant. My friend Laird Scranton, I should invite to the next year's thing, who's been working on a universal cosmology that's expressed in the myths and legends of virtually every piece of civilization around the globe. We've sort of set off something of a cottage industry looking into the various aspects of the past. This is Chauvet again with these brilliant, these horses. Okay, keep going. How are we doing for time here? Okay, now this is the smoking gun, actually. That Chauvet in those caves should be the smoking gun, but everybody knows about them. This is Gobekli Tepe. I don't know how many people in the audience out there knows about Gobekli Tepe. This is an artist's rendition of it. There you see all of the stone circles there. As I said, this is an artist's version of what they looked like when new. I mean, when first built. And there are some 22 closely adjacent stone circles like mini Stonehenges, but you see, they're not so many. And again, everything that I'm talking about is complicated, and you just have to take my word for it. Or if you don't take my word for it, stop listening. But these are massive stone structures. It's always been thought that the first really major stone structure in the world was the pyramid, the step pyramid of Zoser, just south, 10 miles south of the Great Pyramids, supposedly built in set up in the third dynasty, Old Kingdom, supposedly around 2700 BC. Well, these stone circles were covered for some reason. Nobody knows quite. We have some guesses. They were covered completely. You see where the back circles are? These are just drawn in because they know that there are these. They know that there are these buried now, still buried under the earth. There are these other stone circles still awaiting excavation, and even the ones in the front look all nice and neat and tidy. That's the artist extrapolating, and there are remnants of what were there originally, but they were covered over the whole thing, the whole hill. It's acres and acres of hill with 25 or 22, 23, something like that, of these closely adjacent stone circles, and nobody really knows exactly. Or, as I mentioned before, Laird Scranton has a book just out now called something Point of Origin, talking about Gobekli Tepe. And what makes this the smoking gun is that they're able to carbon date the fill, all of the stuff that covered all of this over so that you couldn't see it. It was only discovered in 1994. The archaeologist has been working on it very, very slowly for these, 20 years now. And only, there we go. There are some of the things. You see, it's still all full of filled material. Nobody's sure why they covered it all over. A massive job in its own right, but they can date the fill. And so they date the fill to about 8,000 BC. So Klaus Schmidt, one of the good archaeologists, was working on this for years and just unfortunately died last year in the summer. Yeah, fairly young, in his early 60s. To me, that's young. So he dates it. And this is something that the academics do not challenge, to Gobekli Tepe to at least 10,000 BC and maybe older as they keep excavating. So this is for us our smoking gun, because the argument used against the Sphinx that was suggested by our opposing archaeologist Mark Lehner was that it scoffed. Well, of course they couldn't have done that. This was all hunter-gatherers back then, and he threw out a challenge, show me a potsherd. Well, my answer used to be, well, it was such an advanced society that they didn't use pots. They had paper cups, but that didn't really count as science. But this does. They call it, and these are not small, these pillars. They weigh between 10 and 15 tons. And one of these pictures that you come up with, one of these things, you'll see us, or you'll see people standing next to them, and you see that these strange, keep going. You see these strange cosmological figures. This one, hold on to this one a bit, because this comes from the same find. It comes from the same era. Now, mind you, we're talking about 10,000 BC when there's not supposed to be any civilization at all. So this is a smoking gun. This proves that people were capable of, they might have been wearing bearskins, but they're capable of erecting pillars, making stone circles of pillars weighing between 10 and 15 tons, and carving the different quality of carving. And some of the carvings, the reliefs on there, are really very masterful, and they're high relief, which means that they have to carve the surface of the stone that frees the whatever it is that they're illustrating, a fox or a vulture or a lion, whatever. It looks as though they're emerging out of the stone. Weirdly enough, the excavations that have gone on now, 15 years worth of 20 years of excavation, they have not discovered any tools. That's what makes this little bead here, obviously a bead, and part of what was the fill there. So this is also 10,000 years old. This is a very hard stone. It's a porphyry or a not basalt. It's it's a diorite, I think. And you see that it's got this careful little hole bored right through it, but nobody's found any tools. How did they bore that hole, and why? It looks as though this must have been a necklace of some sort or a pendant, but this is a big mystery in trying, because this is really hard stone. I mean, you need it nowadays, diamond drill or something to get through this stone. And here it is, 10,000 BC or thereabouts, or maybe even older. So you see what's involved actually in all of this, that everything that you've learned in school, I mean, if you bothered to learn it. I was smart, I didn't pay much attention to that stuff. I already knew practically all of it was rubbish. So I was out partying. And I advised it. Actually, my kids who, for my age, they're young kids, I advised them against going to college. And they've been thanking me ever since. Anyway, keep going, Saeed. Okay, more stuff. Now, this is a recent find. This is a bracelet found in Turkey, carved of obsidian, which is a volcanic glass. It's very, very hard stone to carve. And this they date because of the layer in which it was found buried to 8,000 BC. And this is mind-boggling, and it looks quite simple, but the archaeologists studying it have determined that it is actually geometrically very complex. The ring around it and all of that is very carefully calibrated. It's not just decoration. It requires an advanced knowledge of geometry to have produced this little bracelet. And as I said, it's a volcanic glass that is practically impenetrable and very difficult to work. So who are the people who are doing this? What do you have? 2 cavemen, and they're sort of sitting around and say, well, we just shot a rhinoceros, so we got food for a couple of months. Let's get our wives are nagging us. So let's make a nice present for them. And then say, oh yeah, well here, I've got this nice chunk of obsidian here. Let's make a nice little bracelet for her. And the other one says, well, yeah, we should do that, but let's invent geometry so that we can make it look really cool. You have to understand that this is like the little stone. This is a big deal. And I mean, they don't, as I said earlier, I mean, the academics are almost by definition, not entirely, almost by definition, uncreative people. They're in their heads all the time. When you show something like this to an artist or a sculptor or even, a writer, I'm a writer, I'm not a sculptor, but I understand what goes into creative work. And they don't. They analyze, they don't theorize, and they're all card-carrying members of the Church of Progress. So to them, it is absolutely inadmissible. It's like fundamental, even with this present Pope, to suggest that Mary was maybe not a virgin is serious heresy. So this is true. So this is to suggest that ancient, very, very ancient people were in possession of sophisticated mathematical, not just mathematical knowledge, but technological knowledge to build the Osirian and to build those temples alongside the Sphinx. This is heretical, and believe me, if they could torture us to death, they do it, but they can't do that now. And now with the internet, there's a weapon. I mean, the internet could be the salvation. Well, that would take a lot. The salvation of humanity, because it's now possible to get this kind of knowledge out to a lot of people instantaneously. Before, things like this would either, I mean, who knows what there was before, because things got lost over the course of history. But to get new ideas to an audience, even, I mean, before the invention of the computer, you relied upon books. And even then, books were this kind of book that was very difficult to get to a big enough audience that could at least potentially make a difference. Anyway, we'll get into that when I get into, that's tomorrow, the 5 Cowboys, Apocalypse 2.0. We'll get to that one. That's fun. Keep going, Saeed. Okay, now, this. I don't know how. It's.
I want to remind you that this is Eric. I'm taking over for site. I just want to remind you that we are streaming live, but this is wonderful. I like your map.
Yeah. Actually, I cannot claim to have invented this. Actually, unfortunately, I would love to be able to claim most of it. But when Bush stole the second election, somebody anonymously produced this drawing, except that he had the red states and he showed Canada up above it all in blue, which is a big mistake these days. You know what's going on up there. But the red states were all Pakistan, and the blue states were there were variants of it, were either America or the United States of Canada. And the retitling is my doing, because it really isn't. The blue states are not America. They're lesser Pakistan and greater Pakistan. And good. But this is interesting, because that was all over the net. And I can tell by the audience reaction that you never saw that before. And you see, it's too bad. But now, before the computer, this would be maybe in a book somewhere, but I guess he could have shown it. Well, they never would show it on television, because that's all co-opted and owned by major corporations and stuff. So this wonderful piece of art would be unknown. Now you have to go back and tell all your friends who haven't been at this lecture and don't know about this, that here there's the picture that's worth 1,000 words. Well, I put in more than 1,000 words by now, but that picture is worth many of them. There it is. Big fun. What are we doing? Okay. What's next? No, nothing's going.
Good. End of slide, that's why. End of your slideshow.
Oh, that's the end of that show?
End of the slideshow, that's why.
Oh, there should be more stuff. What's of the whole show? No.
Well, when you go back one.
That I sent you.
Yeah.
That's it? Well,
that's it.
No, there's more.
Okay.
Somewhere on there should be more. There's the 5 Cowboys, and there should be a whole another. Is this following it up? This is coming up? No, there should be a whole thing of Symbolist Egypt, and this is, what's the next one after this?
Let me see. Let me scroll down, yeah. We're going to scroll down until you see what you want.
Yeah, let's see. Because Pakistan shouldn't have been there, actually. There should be a whole bunch of things following, what was the last stuff we were looking at? Following those things, Gobekli Tepe, and
Oh, you can see through the video. I got you. Here, look through the video.
Hold on a second. I'm okay, right? We're live, but wait, my dog is freaking out here and wants to go out.
Oh, what a cute dog. What a
yeah,
dog.
He is. Can you see him?
Yes, he's
Hey,
awesome.
you know what he is?
I'll tell you. It's not. Is it a Saluki?
No, you're close. He's an Ibizan hound who are the purebred descendants of the ancient Egyptian hunting dogs.
Yes.
Yeah. He's a very early form of greyhound, and they stayed pure on Ibiza, where I lived all those years when I took off and went to Europe. Hold on.
Is this what you're looking for?
Yeah, exactly.
Wow,
yeah.
How did you know that?
What? What do you mean, how do I know that?
Luckily, I brought a friend, Daniel, to the conference, and he just saved us.
Oh, good. Okay. Because otherwise I would have had to tell jokes for the next hour and a half without pictures there. Hold on a second. Oh, he came back. What he wants is food. We'll have to wait. I'm back. I'm hungry too. You don't see me running around wagging my tail. Now, so these are more pieces of evidence. If we can put our funding together, I second that no one in this particular audience is a visionary billionaire wanting to finance our stuff. These are other pieces to the puzzle. These are megalithic ruins in Sardinia, which is one of the world's great undiscovered or under promoted place of sort of treasury of megalithic ruins of all sorts. And these extraordinary structures are sort of in a way reminiscent of Gobekli Tepe, and they're quite ruinous now, and nobody understands what they are. They're usually dated by the resident archaeologists and I don't know how they did this, at around 2400, 2600 BC. Chuck and I think they could well be older, but we don't have, we haven't done enough of a close study to come up with anything substantive. But there's a lot. There's big stuff happening in this whole lost civilization field that I just can't get into in these two lectures. But they're called Nuraji, may be part of that earlier period or around there when there's this huge catastrophe that happens. And this is solid stuff. I mean, even the academics accept that there are two, or most of them do anyway, that there are two major catastrophic events in the very distant past. And we're pretty sure that this is connected with Gobekli Tepe and with a whole bunch of things that happened afterwards. Around 11,000 BC, there is an astronomical event, probably a comet strike or something of that nature that is to a certain extent localized. I mean, it's all the Ice Age. The Ice Age is in full swing at that time. And this actually is called the Younger Dryas, and I don't know where they get Dryas from, the word Dryas. To look that up, actually. But it's a period that goes over 1,000 years that intensifies the Ice Age. Things get colder and more ice builds up. And then there's another event, and Shaka has been doing a lot of work on this, and another, a plasma physicist at Los Alamos called, what's his name? First name, Louis Perrot. I'll get to him. I forget his first name. We'll touch upon that in a bit. Where there is now you've probably read yourself, the scientists are very much concerned about a massive solar flare, CME, coronary. Let's see. This is not celestial. That was the word I'm looking for. Mass ejection. No, not the such thing, but it's a gigantic solar flare, and there's really a pretty solid evidence. Coronal, that's the word. The coronal mass ejection, and these happen. I mean, they happen fairly often. One in Montreal some years ago, not too long ago, that knocked out the grid for about 6 hours or so. But right, exactly. And they're worried now. And now, see, the latest one of any consequence was actually 150 years ago. It was the 1859 or 57, called the Carrington event. That's what they're called because of an amateur astronomer, I believe, observed this happening, and so it carries his name. But this is a fairly severe CME, and that fried the grid at the time. But the grid at that time was only the telegraph system, and it absolutely knocked that out for quite a while, but didn't do any other significant any damage. But if one of these, even and that's not from the point of view of ancient studies, I mean, that's not, even the Carrington event was a relatively minor one on the scale of gigantic ones. Let's say it was a 3 out of 10. But there have been 10 out of 10 instances of such an event happening. And it is thought by Jacques, by Barat, by a number of people who are studying this, that a much bigger one happened just around 9700 BC, which corresponds quite neatly to Plato's story of Atlantis, which takes place, he says, 9,000 years before he's writing it. He's writing it at about 600 BC or thereabouts. And so the last major CME took place around that time. So, and it's known that these things do happen, that it's not a cycle. It's not like a comet that goes round and round and is predictable, but it does happen at a certain, not even a periodically it happens, but it doesn't have, you can't say it's every 10,000 years or every 12,000 years, but by and large, they're thinking, and this has been in the New Scientist and all kinds of scientific magazines, that we're overdue for one of these. And if such a thing happened now, with everything contingent upon the grid, I mean, we would be this would be a gigantic, an Atlantis-style catastrophe, because imagine what we would do without electricity for months, maybe, at a time. I mean, it would be unthinkable. The only people who would survive would be the people who actually are still surviving in the rainforest and Borneo and places like that where they still don't have electricity. For the rest of us, this would be a monstrosity. And we're thinking with these neurology, such as this one on the thing, we're thinking that conceivably it's done because the only place that you're safe from a CME is a cave somewhere. And whether or not it would work in your own cellar, I don't know. But we're thinking, because nobody knows what these things could have been used for. I mean, we could well be wrong, but it would be, or it could be, something that was built at the time in order to shield them from the CME. We're not sure of that, but it's an interesting hypothesis. Keep going. Who knows? I don't know. Nobody knows. Well, yeah, maybe, because the cave would work. Now this, you see, you're looking up. That's one of the ones that's still complete. You're looking up at the roof, and you see the blocks that it's built out of are just rough stones, but they're pretty big. They're a couple of tons, and you see they built this beautiful, looks like a beehive, with no arch support or anything like that. The arch formed just out of these considerable stones, and you see the size of the neurology. This is a major construction, and Sardinia. You probably always thought, as I did, that's where they invented sardines, but it had nothing to do with sardines. I forget what it means. It's a local word meaning something else, the name of the island. But the whole island is covered with lots and lots of these mysterious, wonderful looking things. And it's a cool island too. I mean, and it's sort of off the radar. The Italians go there often for holidays and things like that. But for most gringos don't go there. This is a great place. Go ahead, keep going. Okay, well, this is more of the same. This is not Sardinia. This is a stone circle deep in the Sahara, southern Sahara, about 40 miles, not too far from the border with Libya, and amidst absolutely trackless desert. And they can date this, again, it's really much more interesting than I can make it sound in a few minutes. They date this as a stone circle. It's known that it has astronomical significance and very sophisticated. All kinds, and not just solstices and equinoxes, but almost certainly stars that represent the belt stars of Orion, which this, according to Robert Bauval, the theory I'm right on board with, that the three pyramids of Giza are meant to symbolize or represent the belt stars of the constellation of Orion. And the same kind of formation is part of this stone circle. And the archaeologists, for dating with layers of sand and things that they found in the sand, they date this to about 6,000 BC. Now, Stonehenge is supposed to be built around 3,000 BC. So this is much older than Stonehenge, and yet it has a sophisticated astronomy encoded in it. So out in the middle of the desert where nothing else is. So it means that a precise astronomy is known as far back as 6,000 BC, and by extension, probably a lot longer. And what did they need it for? Why, the usual explanation, believe it or not, is that they wanted to know, they did all of these careful calculations to know, when planting was supposed to begin. I mean, I think some of these guys, not only are they uncreative, they've never been outside of their university ivory tower. Because if you live in the country, you know exactly when to plant everything. All you have to do is live there for a couple of years to know when things are growing. I mean, you have to really get involved with these pseudosciences to realize how dumb they are. Most of them. Exceptions always made, just in case there are any in the audience here. Okay, keep going. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I wanted to ask,
Sure.
Usually when I take pictures of these there's no scale, but luckily there were footprints there. So, so they were pretty short.
Well, this is one of the sort of standing stones of that stone circle. The other stones that we were looking at were mostly sort of
like 3 feet,
the size of 4 size of a very small car.
Yeah.
But the bigger stones this is probably 8-10 feet high, and of course it's tilted over and it's very ruinous now. But in its original, there's enough there so that they could reconstruct at least the shape of the circle, and lots of the stones are still around there. But it's way out in the desert. It takes a 4-wheel drive days to get there, and it's off limits because of security and all the rest of the stuff. So you can't get to it. And I've not actually been. So Val's been there a few times, and some of my other friends have been there. Okay, keep going. Okay, that's the circle itself, and these
marker stones.
So marker stones. Not Bauval. This has been studied by a physicist and archaeoastronomer named Thomas Brophy, who recently wrote a book with Bauval, and he's the one who came up with these representing the belt stars of Orion. And I forget what these two things are, but he developed a very complex interpretation of Nabta Playa. And even if there are sort of 3 major pieces to this interpretation. And the first one is Orion's belt, and the careful, why it's this way, and an ellipse, and so on. And that I'm 100% in agreement with the other two aspects of it that incorporates the speed, the expanding universe, the speed and distances to the stars. That I'm not so sure about. And then a piece in between where there's a stone that's now covered back over with sand that looks like a map of the universe itself. And that's pretty interesting. There's a book, he's written a book called the devil is it called? Something of Origins. Anyway, his name is Thomas Brophy. If you Google him up, you'll find the book. Okay, keep going. Okay, this is another one of those wonders like the little stone bead that we saw. This is in the Cairo Museum. It's about the size of maybe it's 3 quarts or thereabouts. And it's made in one piece of a very, very hard stone called a schist. And it's hollow. The whole thing is hollow, and the width of the lip of it is about the thickness of the walls. Now, why anybody would want to do such a thing is very difficult to determine, because it's you can't get to it to lift it up or something, but it's got to weigh quite a few pounds. This is a very heavy stone, and you don't need that to transport, to keep water, to transport milk or whatever. But the problem with it is, how do you hollow it out without anything resembling a diamond drill? And even now, this would be a problem because it's one piece. So even now, this would mean clay. It's easy, you throw it on a wheel, but to hollow out such a thing is a monumental task. And then why they should do it in the first place, we don't know. And this is all pre-dynastic. In other words, it's prior to 3000 BC. And a number of these kinds of things, these stone vases, have been found. And then they're only very early. Afterwards, the Egyptians are no longer doing that. So that's a couple of friends of mine, hypothesize, you can't prove it, hypothesize that conceivably these were heirlooms handed down from that earlier civilization capable of building the Sphinx and the temples around it. And I mean, unless you break them, they're never going to weather away. I mean, even if they're outside 10,000 years, they're barely going to show any effects, especially in a desert climate, show any effect of weathering. So this is another of those big mysteries enshrined in a relatively small artifact. Keep going.
That's how you tell the Buddha heads when they're made of the gray schist stone. They're from northern India. It's from northern India, and
well, carving them is one thing, but hollowing them out in this shape is quite another.
What do you think about if it was turned like a pottery, like it was soft at one time?
Conceivably,
soft
but
and then got hard.
How are you going to drill it? How are you going to drill it?
No drill, turned.
It's all one piece. The handle is one piece too.
Yeah, it is. It's connected.
This is a lot of people have tried to figure this out. How they could conceivably have done it, and then why they should have done it.
Edvard Leedskallen, who built Coral Castle by himself.
Different. Well, that's a big mystery too. Nobody knows how he does it.
When you talk to Michael Tellinger, we were talking about how there are certain times when everything has to be just right. It's like a cement. It's soft, pliable. You can mold it. So
well, that's
I know. I'm just throwing it out there so you have some extra variables.
That is a hypothesis, and it's not impossible.
Because pottery and turned on a wheel, who knows? It's
maybe they had ways of dealing with material that we no longer have, and apparently
that's what I'm thinking. That's my suggestion.
This is possible. Egypt is full of things like that. Actually, is an interesting book. Okay. We only have a few more minutes, so this is my criminal partner. I mean, I do not say that lightly. Stolen $150,000 from the till, so we couldn't carry on with our next work. Swinging the digital sledgehammer. He liked doing that. Actually, he's a remarkable character, and I don't even begrudge him stealing all that money. Well, I begrudge him a little, but without him, the whole project would never have happened. I mean, I can think straight, but I'm not very good at organizing things. And he got the money together and got people behind it and all the rest of it, and then stole 150 grand. Anyway, he's no longer with us. Now here, that's the readout, because we were also, that's when Boris is swinging the sledge and hitting a stone, a metal plate that sends shockwave into the ground, acoustic waves, and then it gives a readout, which is sort of the effect of an underground X-ray. And here you have actually the X-ray, and you see the Sphinx's peak, top right, and you see the gray area, the dark area. Well, that shows that there's a cavern there of some sort, a cavern or a chamber or a void. And from the look of it, according to the geophysicist who was with us, he said, it looks as though it could be man-made. And everybody, no week goes by in which somebody says, when are they going to excavate that chamber? Well, one, we're not 100% sure of the chamber. Two, it's under 15 feet of bedrock. And if it is man-made, there ought to be a passageway leading into it, but the seismographs never found that. On the other hand, we were getting chased all over the plateau by the authorities when we were doing the filming, who didn't want us to film anything. So it could be that we've missed it. And now it's under the rising water table is such that they could, if they wanted to, stick a fiber up, drill a little hole and stick a fiber optic camera down there. But they haven't done it, and you can't do that sort of thing without permission. So, and anyhow, to me, it's much more important to establish once and for all definitively that the water weathering really is the water weathering, with all of those, you might say, a cascade of implications attached to that, meaning no less than that we have to throw out everything we've ever learned about very, very ancient civilization and recognize that the greatest sculpture on earth, with temples alongside it that we couldn't reproduce today, means that people were around who could carve the most spectacular sculpture on earth and who could wrestle around the kind of stones that we can't handle today, and recognize that we are not civilized compared to those people. They are a much higher level of civilization that we are, or can even imagine. And then what gets even more interesting is when you study comparative mythology and you look into it, practically every society, so-called primitive, which aren't really primitive, they're unintellectualized, doesn't mean primitive. The shamans of the rainforest are a lot more civilized than the imbeciles who work on Wall Street. The lesson is as I said, that these myths from all over the world talk about the giants of old, or the great men of old, or the sages of old, and this is not just imagination. I mean, this is the proof. Looking now for basically 2 hours of proof with a few jokes thrown in, but you've been looking at 2 hours of really solid, unchallengeable evidence demonstrating that unless you're really among the 5 cowboys, or a believer in the 5 cowboys of Apocalypse 2.0, Liz Shock's latest book. We're almost finished here.
I wanted to say Larry Dean Hunter was saying that you could fit the Vatican underneath there. And
what's that?
The Vatican. You could fit the Vatican underneath there, and it's water. And he showed us some of the entrance holes. So I have to teach you.
Under the Sphinx?
Yeah.
No.
No, not under the Sphinx. Under the city, underneath the whole plateau.
No, I don't believe it.
Water. Well, they could hear it. They could hear what they saw. Well, I'll talk to you later, Eric.
Okay.
Dadhmer. Okay. This was great. I'm sorry I missed the beginning. I had my own lecture, but this was awesome.
Over?
Pardon me?
Should I start over?
No. This is great. We have a lecture now at 5.
What?
Yes. What? We have one question from the audience.
Go ahead.
Hi, actually, I love watching all your videos. I see you online, and I'm so honored to be here with you today. But one question that I wanted to ask you, if I have to narrow it down to one, is the about Coral Castle.
Oh yeah.
In Florida. I actually learned about that, and I know that Ed, the person who created Coral Castle, right, said his purpose for creating it was to prove to the average person that they could use and do the same technology that was used to build the Sphinx. So I wanted to get your feedback on that, and have you ever even looked at the Coral Castle, and what are your thoughts about that?
Oh yeah, well I've been there, and and actually, I mean it's pretty miraculous, and I know that Litzkalnin talks about the. I mean,
he had the secret
he
of how they built the pyramids, and then Michael Tellinger.
He claimed that he had rediscovered the secrets of the ancient Egyptians. The problem is that nobody knows what those secrets were because he took it to the grave.
Right.
And
I'll talk to you.
They have discovered. I mean, he was doing things single-handed that that seem absolutely miraculous, but you don't know. In other words, you have these incredible things in Egypt. They might have had a very different thing that some other method that they built it. But since we don't know how Eddie did them, and we also don't know how the Egyptians did them, it has to remain conjecture until somebody can demonstrate. I mean, if you're going to do scholarship, you have to play by the rules, even though the scholars themselves do not. This is one of the ironies of this sort of work, that any kind of little mistake that you make or that I make, let's say, they jump on like dogs on a bone. But if they come up with something completely wrong and outrageous, they, within the field, within their own ivory tower, they will say, oh, well, so-and-so made a mistake. We get murdered, but they made a mistake. Anyway, so this is all symbolist Egypt that we're looking at. So we don't want to see this now. This is tomorrow.
Thank you. There was an excellent lecture. Thank you very much. Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to friending you. Yes, we're going to talk to you tomorrow.
You're welcome.
Yeah, tomorrow. Look forward to talking tomorrow. See you tomorrow.
Okay. I will be here.